Good evening, space monkeys! I am your host, BlueHighwind, and this is Freelancin, a podcast where I talk about nerdy subjects to a very, very small audience. This happens weekly, unless nothing happened like last week, in which case I had nothing to say about anything, so I recorded about 40 minutes of nothing and thought about posting it, but then I realized that was really, really stupid, and barely anyone wants to listen to this anyway, so, why would I post nothing? Seems meaningless. Anyway, this week's subject is Star Wars. Again, sorry, Star Wars is going to be very much in the news for the next year, for a while, about the next decade, probably until the end of time. Star Wars is going to be there, because Disney is going to merchandise and marketize and manufacturize and productionize Star Wars until it stops turning a profit, which is going to take a lot, because, in case you haven't noticed, Star Wars is very popular. Anyway, the subject this week is the Star Wars prequel, specifically a recut of the Star Wars prequels, which came out just this weekend, which is known as the Topher Grace Cut. Now, you may know Topher Grace. He is an actor. He was on that 70s show, very much applauded for that. Not quite so much applauded when he appeared in Spider-Man 3 as Venom. Yeah, Topher Grace, nobody's forgotten about that. Anyway, this cut really has nothing to do with Topher Grace, besides the fact that I think somewhere along the line he might have given an interview and given this rough idea of how to recut the prequels. Now, whoever actually did this posted this recut on Vimeo. It's a 2-hour and 45-minute recut of the first of all three Star Wars prequels, sliced down from their original length, which is something around 6 hours, to less than half, 2 hours 45 minutes. Now, it was on Vimeo for maybe a day at best. Internet journalists went and jumped on it, they reported on it, they used it, just like I am, for material, and then it got taken down because, as it turns out, you cannot actually post somebody else's movie for free and not expect a takedown. But luckily, it is now currently on a bay of the pirate variety, and you could use a certain thing. I don't want to make it too obvious, but it starts with a T and ends in orants. So use those, and you can have the movie in about 10 minutes. And this recut, which is sometimes known as the Topher Grace Cut, but more officially known as Star Wars Episode 3.1, Turn to the Dark Side, which is a terrible name, but we'll get into that. Now, you might be wondering, why would somebody go and put through all the time to recut the Star Wars prequels? Aren't there, say, professionals in Hollywood who have spent their entire lives studying a craft, who have mastered the art of making a flowing movie, a major studio which spent about a decade producing these Star Wars prequels? Aren't they good on their own? The answer is a resounding no. Basically, nobody likes the prequels, aside from people who, I guess, were born after 1995 and didn't really know Star Wars on its own. This is the first Star Wars movies they ever saw, so if they see the old ones, they're jaded enough and they're not used to old cinema. You know what? No, if you like the prequels better than the originals, there's something fundamentally wrong. You just don't really get movies. You can enjoy the prequels. God help you if you like the prequels. I'm not going to tell you not to like them, but there are clear fundamental problems with them which are not present in the originals. The originals, I still stand up. Years and years later, I am completely in love with them. They are my favorite movies of all time. They just are. It's just what I am. I love the Star Wars original trilogy. And what's weird is, since I've just watched Turn to the Dark Side a few days ago, one thing I noticed is just how cheap looking the prequels are. Because this is a weird cut. It has special effects going back from 1999 to 2005, so already these special effects are about 10 years old. But when they came out, they were top of the line. They were cutting edge. And this is really the one thing the Star Wars prequels had. They had the best of the best special effects. And unfortunately, 10 years later, CG has gotten to the place where it's used much more effectively, and the movies look bad. The special effects just really don't hold up. They hold up in some places, but they don't in others. It's, yeah, and unfortunately, there are much deeper problems with the prequels. I'm gonna go on a brief review, just in case you've forgotten. Alright, let's start off. Number 1, Jar Jar Binks. He's the problem that everyone goes to straight to. Like, oh, Star Wars prequels, oh, that's the one with Jar Jar Binks. He was just in the first one, really. He had little cameos in the next two. He was unimportant. He's not the main problem, but he is basically the symbolic problem. People look at Jar Jar Binks, he's a really, really annoying character, very ill-conceived, shouldn't have been in the movies in the first place, or should have been used in a better way. You just don't have a character that's purely an idiot. I mean, you compare him to the comic reliefs of the original trilogy, R2-D2, C-3PO, those two, they're funny. They add something to the plot. They have an interesting perspective on the story because they're robots. Even though they are fully fledged characters and they're lovable in their own way, no one really treats R2-D2 and C-3PO all that seriously. They treat them like talking toasters, basically. And that's funny. Jar Jar Binks is just an idiot. There's really nothing there. Moving on, Episode 1 has really barely any plot at all. There's no protagonist. Episode 2 has, of course, the legendarily bad Hayden Christensen acting with his just ungodly, just awful, awful chemistry with Natalie Portman, which is not Hayden Christensen and Natalie Portman's fault. It's more and more the fault of the script and the director. George Lucas just, at some point, I don't want to be one of those people who's like, oh, George Lucas killed my childhood. George Lucas created my childhood. I wouldn't have had a childhood without him. I want to give the man a hug. But somewhere between the 20 years between his two trilogies, the man kind of lost the ability to direct people. And surprisingly, the prequels are very lazily produced. Like, a lot of the scene designs and ideas are just kind of like really low-hanging fruit. It's like, alright, that was in the original trilogy, let's just go and make a visual motif off of that. You know, you look at the prequels, they barely stand up on their own as artistic entities, because so much of the art design is just kind of copies of their own spin on the old stuff, and there's incredibly lazy blocking in these movies. Like, some of the laziest I've ever, like, it's unimaginable considering how much money was poured into these prequels that they couldn't have put together more interesting cinematography and more interesting character interaction. Because if it's not a fight scene, they just didn't care. It's basically just people sitting on couches. And there's always those legendarily bad lines like, oh Anakin, you've grown! You've grown too. More beautiful, that is. Oh, God. And, I don't like sand. Sand on my home planet is rough. It got everywhere. Not like here. It is so smooth here. Like your skin. Let me kiss you. Ew. No, I don't buy that at all. And you know what? Even episode 3, the one that everyone loves, that one kind of sucks too. Because, I mean, the whole idea of the prequel trilogy, kind of ill-conceived in its own way, is kind of making Darth Vader the center of the Star Wars universe. Which is not how it ever should have been. He's the bad guy. The center of the Star Wars universe is Luke. He's the hero. Darth Vader is the bad guy, the dark figure of what might happen to Luke if he doesn't follow the path correctly. But it is interesting to go see what could happen to a character who's well-meaning and then falls down. Unfortunately, they don't even bother trying to do that until episode 3. Episode 1 just has him as this loudmouth kid who doesn't really have much of a personality. Episode 2 just has him really bitchy and teenage, and you want to fucking throttle him, or just, like, take a plastic bat and start beating him over the head. Just shut the fuck up! I'm sick of your goddamn bullshit. Go to your fucking room. No Jedi for you for a month. You're grounded, mister. Yeah, teenagers suck. Hayden Christensen sucks in episode 2. Which, to be fair, he's a better actor. Everyone's a better actor. Everybody who's in these movies are decreased. So, looking on that, what you have is a bunch of movies that are mainly a few really, really good fight scenes here and there. There's the great fight between the two Jedis and Darth Maul at the end of episode 1. I really like the asteroid fight in episode 2. There's the monster arena battle, also in episode 2. That one's cool. That still stands up, actually. Those effects are great. And Ben Burtt's sound design for those monster roars is fantastic. I love you, Ben Burtt. I just wish you hadn't edited these prequel movies, because you didn't do a very good job, unfortunately. So, based on that, those few great things. There might be a funny line every so often. They're not the worst movies ever made, but they are very bad. If I had my blog back in the day and I was an adult reviewing those movies, I'd like to think they would have ended up, like, pretty much all of them on my worst of list at the end of the year, or I would not have given them any of those movies a rating higher than mediocre. Bad and terrible is basically the entire thing. Nothing, like, so bad that you want to just, like, start stabbing people. There aren't many movies like that. The Star Wars prequels aren't that bad, but they are quite bad. So it's kind of been let's say, a journey that the fan base of Star Wars has taken over these last years, dealing with these terrible, terrible movies, which ultimately, due to their badness, I think have wound up being more examined and more studied than any other film trilogy ever. Like, you'll just find everybody in the world has their own thoughts to say about the Star Wars prequels. Everyone's got their own opinions. People watch the originals and they're like, that's just a good movie. They don't even, like, study why they're great. But the prequels have wound up almost getting more thought than the first ones have, which is disappointing in its own way, but it's become like this weird cinema discipline. We're gonna find out what's wrong with the prequels, and we're gonna fix it. And this goes back all the way to, I think, 2000 or even 1999 itself, when the first fan cut, I'm not sure if this is the first fan cut in all of history. I'm sure somebody has done something like this before, but it was the first one to gain major notoriety. This was known as the Phantom Edit, which took the worst parts of Episode 1 and cut them away, and this guy was a professional editor. He's only known as the Phantom, and he tried his best using his skills to go and make a better flowing movie. And I actually reviewed the Phantom Edit a few years ago, and my conclusion was not that great. I don't think he did. I admire what he was trying to do, but I think it was generally impossible with the material in Episode 1 to make that movie work. If anything, I think he might have made it worse because he cut out the underwater fight scene, which I really like, and some of the character development early on. It might slow the movie down, but it also means that there's less character to the overall movie, ultimately. So, Episode 1, it's bad no matter what you do with it. Episode 2, this guy worked on too. It was called Attack of the Phantom. And this, I think, was actually a major success, because by the time he got done with it, he cut out most of the fluff, the bullshit, the worst lines. He re-edited some scenes so it looked like Padme and Anakin actually had sex, which builds the tension so much more and makes their relationship seem more meaningful. Most of the completely fluffy romance scenes he just kind of removed, because they don't do anything. It's just like, the romance makes no sense because most of it is just like, oh look, they're happy in a field, they're happy over here. Like, he doesn't do that. He cut that, he added in a few great scenes, and Attack of the Phantom is, if you could find it, it's a good movie, I'd go see it. Now, this cut, the Topher Grace Cut, was not done by a professional editor. And I could tell immediately because some of the cuts just really make no sense. This editor, I don't want to be too negative to him, because he probably did a better job than I could. But a lot of his cuts, he doesn't really seem to understand the rhythm of scenes and what's moving. The movie is very, very slow because of what he's done. And a lot of scenes just end in completely incomprehensible ways, especially in his cuts in Episode 2. Like, there's one scene, Anakin's talking to Palpatine, who is obviously evil. And they're talking about some bullshit, I don't know what's going on. And then Palpatine's eventually starting to, build up the kid's ego, and he's like, oh, I can sense that you are becoming the greatest of all Jedis. And then they kind of stare at each other for 1, 2 seconds, and sidewipe. And it's so weird, because, like, that scene didn't end that way. It doesn't feel like it should have ended that way. It's just kind of like this weird, awkward end of momentum. Like, that's not the end of the conversation. And the next scene, Anakin's in a completely different location. Like, when did he move? What happened? Like, it's always weird. I always find that jarring, that if you're gonna cut and a character's in a new place, it just shouldn't, it really looks weird for that to ever happen. Especially if you're gonna cut between tones like that, because you're going from kind of a dark foreboding scene and now it's romantic-ish scene. You gotta have some sort of pacing between that. You gotta let the natural rhythms of the movie move. And some of his cuts to the romance scenes actually made them worse, because Anakin at one point has this terrible line where they're talking about dreams, and he's like, you're just as beautiful as I remember when I dream about you and I'm jerking off and ew, ew. Thank you. Thank you, Anakin. You can be quiet. And it ends on this incredibly unintentional comic note, because they both kind of they get really uncomfortable. And I think in the original movie, they say something else to kind of save the moment, so it's but no, in this one it just cuts and now they're on Naboo. And it's ew, alright, they just kind of sat uncomfortably for hours after that. Yeah. Another thing this editor is really in love with is sidewipes. Which, if you watch Star Wars, this is a particular scene transition that basically is only ever used in Star Wars. It's when the screen kind of swipes across and there's a small dissolve between them. This is only Star Wars ever manages to. It's iconic of the Star Wars trilogies in these movies. Because I've never actually seen another movie that's done sidewipes. It's kind of it's just a Star Wars thing. But even in the Star Wars movies, not every single scene ends with a sidewipe. But this editor, he decided, you know what, that's the one transition I like, so he ended every scene with a sidewipe, or a down swipe, or at one point he has a swipe that goes up and down on opposite sides of the screen, so it looks like a fucking Photoshop transition. Not a Photoshop, a fucking PowerPoint transition. Which is, no, please don't. Now, I actually haven't gone over what the topic, what the body of this movie is. Now, the concept here, and this is Topher Grace's original idea, is that you cut out most of episode 1, because it doesn't really contribute anything. You leave in the final fight as the opening to your movie, and you kind of reformat the plot slightly so it just opens with the Jedis landing on Naboo and fighting Darth Maul. And then you keep most of episode 2, but you cut out all of the little nonsense, so it's about 50% of episode 2. That's kind of your first act there. Episode 1's piece is just the opening, get excited moment. Episode 2 is a first act, it's Anakin and Padme falling in love, you can see the darkness building of the Separatists. Episode 3 is mostly uncut. He basically just kept 90% of that movie unchanged. And I can kind of see where they're going from. It's great to have a shorter version of the prequels, because if you have to watch these fucking movies, I guess it's better to watch it in 3 hours than 6. But, unfortunately, because he's not a very good editor, and possibly because the material itself isn't very good, there's really nothing you could do to fix these movies full stop. You can limit the damage that's been done, but you cannot fix it unless you actually have $200 million, you get all the actors back, and you write up a whole new script with new special effects and everything. Because, yeah, it's tough. Because you still have these terrible, terrible lines. You still have these bad, bad scenes that you just cannot do anything with. And this editor, he doesn't really make it flow any better. Because I can see where the idea, alright, cool, we're gonna start with a big Jedi fight. That sounds great. It's one of the best scenes of possibly this whole Star Wars trilogy. I mean, when Darth Maul went and popped out 2 lightsabers, double-sided lightsaber, that's a moment that the theater howled, holy fucking shit. That is so cool. I've never seen anything like that. Never even imagined anything like that. Number 1, one of my favorite, I think as a kid, that might have been the most exciting moment I've ever had in a theater, when Darth Maul did that. And this time, it's alright, they're fighting, but these characters haven't been established yet. And it's weird, because he kept the entire fight without any of the other interruptions that happened at the end of episode 1. So nobody talks for a good 5 minutes at the start of the movie. And you can't really have a movie run for 5 minutes with no dialogue at all. I mean, some movies can do that. You can have kind of non-express dialogue, but for a movie like this, you kind of want to know who the hell these people are. And you don't know who Qui-Gon Jinn is. And when he dies at the end of the fight, who cares? It's just Liam Neeson who hasn't talked. And worse, because the editor decided to cut certain things, this person not Topher Grace, cutting things, you lose details. And there's actually not exactly plot holes, but things that aren't established. So, for example, you don't know that Coruscant is Coruscant. You would just have to know that if you've seen the movies. That's not established, but that's a minor thing. You don't know who the droid armies are, and characters reference events that haven't happened. So in the episode 2 sequence, they mention the bombing of Padme Amidala's starship, which has never been seen. He cut out that. Episode 3 references a giant star battle that happened at the end of that movie, which he cut out. And I can see why he'd want to cut out that giant star battle, because he cut out most of the climax of episode 2. No other way to end that sentence but with 2 twos. He cut out those 2 big fights, because ultimately what would have happened with his movie is that 2/3 of the way through you would have had like 45 minutes of nothing but fight scenes, which would have been exhausting. It would have been like the ending of Man of Steel. And that's not even the climax of your movie, so I can see why you'd want to do that. But unfortunately, this means that Count Dooku, who's still in the movies in episode 2, he disappears without a trace. General Grievous is never established, even though he wasn't really established in episode 3 either. And so, like, I remember seeing that movie, I'm like, who the fuck is this robot guy? Why do I care about him? Where's Count Dooku? He was the man last time. That was Christopher Lee! Why'd you just kill him off? I guess it's even worse to kill him off camera. But yeah, it's just, I found the movie exhausting, and it was a really hard sit. I could not sit through Star Wars Episode 3.1. I was mostly just there, I'm like, alright, I'm doing this for the website now. I'm gonna start taking notes. And that's a bad sign. If I'm taking notes, that's never any good. So, I'm watching this, and about an hour goes by, and I've finally hit the end of Episode 2. I've noted all the changes, and I'm kind of like, alright, whatever's left of this movie, obviously is just going to be Episode 3, because there was no time for him to add anything else in, so I started hitting the fast forward on my beloved VLC media player, and jump, ending! And unfortunately, the ending ends with yet another bad editing decision, which seems good on paper. Okay, he moved the ending of Episode 3 around, so that it ends with, the way that movie ends is that Darth Vader has his terrible goddamn no scene, and then I think it ends with them dropping the kids off and Star Wars music. In this one, he moved them to dropping the kids off, and then you see little dwarf people working on burnt out Anakin Skywalker, and then Darth Vader shows up. Now, this sounds good, because the no scene is one of the worst scenes, I think the worst scene of the entire prequels. If any one scene represents how little they fucking knew of what they were doing, it's no! Because it starts out, and you see Darth Vader rise up, and it ends, you see, like, they put the mask on, and then you hear that iconic Darth Vader breathing, which is where the scene should have ended. Because it's like, alright, we got it. Now he's Darth Vader now. I understand. I recognize that sound clip. There's the iconic moment. His transformation's over. We can move on to Episode 4. Lucas couldn't just leave it at that. The editor does. He does cut it there, which bravo to him. You're not a dumb man. I just think this is possibly a first draft. Maybe you should go again, try again. I congratulate what you were doing, Mr. Editor, who is not Topher Grace, but it didn't work. I just want you to know that. And I mean you all the luck in the world, Mr. Editor. But back on George Lucas, he couldn't leave it alone. So he has Darth Vader come up, and you have all of a sudden the iconic Darth Vader voice coming in. And he starts saying exactly the word that you don't want him to say, the word that Darth Vader never should say, which is Padme. Like, alright, James Earl Jones cannot say the word Padme. It doesn't fit, because there's a huge character division between the Anakin Skywalker of the prequels and the Darth Vader of the original trilogy. These two characters don't really link up as George Lucas thinks they do, I'm sorry to say. So, Padme, coming out of Darth Vader's voice, sounds completely wrong, because Darth Vader isn't really an affectionate guy. He's cold and calculating, and saying Padme's wrong, and him stepping out of the thing like a Frankenstein is wrong, and him yelling, "No!" is really wrong, and that's when you start laughing your ass off. And it gets even better when Chinese subtitles translate that line to "do not want." Alright, what the editor did is he decided, I'm just going to go and cut at the breathing. And, alright, congratulations, good work there. But then he does a bizarre cut, which is like a zoom-in dissolve. And then we're at the end credits, and then you hear happy Star Wars music. I'm sorry, why are we having happy Star Wars music? That's completely inappropriate for the scene that just followed. I mean, yeah, I know it ends on a shitty note, but, you know, at least episode 3, it kind of, like, got you out of it, and it, like, had some hope for the future. And even Empire Strikes Back, it ends with that fantastic scene of them all staring at the galaxy. And it's like, alright, you can see the heroes have survived this adventure, they are still united, they are still friends, they're gonna find Han Solo, and they're gonna win. And now you have happy Star Wars music. This does not call for happy Star Wars music. It's a bad cut. Sorry. And that really just kind of says the whole thing, I think, of the Topher Grace edit. Which is that it just didn't understand the tones and the mood of what it was trying to do. It just doesn't work. And I'm sorry about that. I'd love to see a good version of the prequels, but I think you have to actually make 3 whole new movies, which I have suggested on my blog, and I don't think my version is... If you ever filmed those rough specs I wrote up years and years ago, they probably wouldn't come out that great. I'm going to be honest about that, but you just really have to just rethink the entire storyline, which is one thing I like about the Topher Grace edit. It's like, okay, we understand that this structure that George Lucas has come up with, which he really was just making up on his own, that doesn't work. We're going to try to make a new structure that's possibly a better flowing film. And it doesn't flow any better. It just doesn't feel like one movie. It feels like 3 movies stitched together awkwardly. Even when you do kind of just sit back and just like, alright, I'm watching a movie. If you do that, it just feels really slow and terrible. Which is what the prequels are. They're slow and terrible, and I don't think you can fix them. So anyway, blog stuff. What else is there to talk about? There is, for the next week, I will be reviewing Legends of Oz, Dorothy's Return. Just so you can know, there are indeed movies worse than the Star Wars prequels, and this is one of them. Yeah. On better news, Godzilla's coming out tomorrow night, which I will be seeing tomorrow night, assuming work doesn't get in the way, in which case I'll see it Friday night. But whatever, big review, Star Wars, no, not Star Wars, Godzilla, Godzilla, woo, Godzilla, woo! Yeah, that's kind of all I got for this week. As always, I have been your humble host, BlueHighwind. You have been my lovely space monkeys. Thank you very much.